So would you like blast templates to return to Warhammer 40k or not? Let's talk about some of the pros and cons to using them versus the current blast system. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk some blast templates and scatter dice, and take a bit of a retrospective look at one mechanic that really quite a lot of people would be broadly positive about returning to the game, though at the same time definitely came with some downsides and drawbacks. Blast templates in Warhammer 40k certainly feel like a fairly big nostalgic part of the hobby for me. Something that had existed since the game's early days, basically having your little blast and flamer templates, overlaying them over squads to see how many models that you hit, alongside armor facings and force organisation charts and things that definitely bring back some good memories, though just possibly some slightly rose-tinted glasses ones. This was just the way that big explosive guns functioned prior to 8th edition, so blast templates in the normal sense have been gone from mainline Warhammer 40k for around about the last 8 years or so now. Every so often they're perhaps one of the mechanics that's most talked about in terms of things that people might like to bring back, and I think they did have some interesting positives and fun factor, even if they did have downsides too. It's not like they've gone away for literally everyone as well. Warhammer 40k isn't Games Workshop's only game system. The Horus Heresy still functions more along the sort of 7th edition and prior rule set sort of lines. They still remain the same functional sort of part of the game there. You can still use them with an active rule set. Of course, go back to play old editions, but that certainly can take a bit of time, effort and relearning. While sitting down to make this video, I thought I'd make a quick snap channel poll, asking regular channel viewers whether or not they'd want to see blast templates return to Warhammer 40k. And to be honest, the results were kind of surprisingly positive in my opinion. 44% of people said yes, 29% said no, and the remaining 26% said they had no strong feelings on the matter. I did find it kind of interesting as well that despite the overall vote broadly seeming like it's slightly in favour of blast templates, there's a really big chunk of the hobby both for and against, and interestingly in the comments under this poll, the vast majority of ones that were more upvoted tended to be ones articulating why they didn't want blast templates back, as opposed to positive ones. That's just what it felt like on aggregate. It's worth bearing in mind though that the majority of people answering that poll haven't necessarily played 40k with blast templates before. In a quick follow-up one, I asked what percentage of people started in 8th edition or later, and 66% of people had. So even mathematically there's a good chunk of people voting for blast templates who's never had the experience of playing with them. While I'm sure people have lots of nostalgia for them, there also seem to be lots of people who've actually played with them and remember the downsides. For roughly how they worked in Warhammer 40k, they did change and get reinterpreted a bit from edition to edition, different variations as to exactly how they scattered or what would happen for the models over the edge of the template and things like that, but the rough gist of it when they went away in 7th edition, the rough gist of it was that you'd place the whole of the blast template over a miniature, you'd roll a scatter dice and 2d6 next to it. If a hit marker was scored, typically it'd stay in place, though if you rolled an arrow you'd check the result on those 2d6, take off the ballistic skill of the model that was firing it, usually high numbers were better back in those days, and then move the template by the corresponding amount. You then get one automatic hit on the target unit per model that was covered by the blast template, and there were a bunch of variants with, say, more restrictive things for ignores line of sight weapons, and how they interacted with vehicles, like say having to have the hole over the hull of the vehicle, otherwise they'd just be glanced or have a weaker hit of some sort. Again, things changed quite a bit from one edition to the next. Typically they'd be fired either with a 3-inch small blast template or 5-inch large blast ones as the main two options, and for really big scale 40k with a bunch of Titan weapons and super heavies and things, there were some apocalypse sized templates, pretty much the size of literal dinner plates. Some of the main implications of this were that you could get a lot more hits if a unit was very bunched up versus very spread out. You might be able to hit multiple units at once as opposed to just one squad with most weapons these days. And you might get unusual or surprising scatter results. You might scatter a blast template and it still hits something very useful, or get unlucky if you've fired too close to your own troops and have the blast template casually move over your own squad and wipe out a bunch of them. I'll probably focus a bit more on blast templates for this one, but flamer templates had some similar things but less randomness. They had a sort of round about 8 or 9 inch long template that tapered at one end. You place the small end in base contact with your model, and then the amount of miniatures covered by the flame template will be the number hit. There's no real randomness to this one, just guaranteed hits, and in some later editions they had a sort of wall of death overwatch mechanic for units charging them, which could maybe have a few flamer hits with a random d6 kind of similar to now. As we know, all this got replaced. In later editions, with 8th edition's big reset, basically blast weapons became random numbers of shot weapons. It certainly made it more straightforward to resolve and stripped out a big mechanic that could take some time to resolve, but I felt like in 8th the feel of them was really quite off. In my opinion, they've improved on the rules into 9th edition and 10th edition. 9th edition had the system where you might be able to re-roll or to get automatic max shots against great big ranked up units. In 10th edition they had the slightly more granular one where blast weapons still have a random number of shots, but then you add +1 to the number of shots that you get per blast weapon per 5 models in the enemy unit that's targeted, so you can get a very meaningful amount more shots against big horde style units, and blast weapons definitely do provide meaningful anti-horde firepower in 10th. They also have the downside that most of them can't fire in melee with the big guns never tire rule or similar. Basically the mechanic is a lot more consolidated into the more normal shooting mechanics now. Before we get into some of the more obvious pros and cons of the systems, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Only Games Crates, who basically wanted to share their offering of a 3D printed miniature loot box sort of subscription, the idea being a little painting project to turn up once a month with 3 miniatures inside it, and I've got quite a good sign up deal where you basically get the first month completely free outside of paying for postage. The service also gives you discount codes for creators on their site as well. Using the April month as the current example, if you use the discount code Auspex Crate when you ordered them, basically it reduces the normal cost, which is typically £15, $19 or €18, down to just paying postage for the first month. So basically these 3 sci-fi soldiers by Ronin Art Studio, down to £6 or $9 including shipping. This particular one is some human-sized infantry, a jump pack trooper, a gunslinger lady, and a more standard rank-and-file rifleman. I'd say not 2 or 4 for £2 or $3 per miniature. If you choose to stay signed up after that, it goes back to the more regular price, so £15 or $19. They've got a couple more crate offerings as well, including a pre-coloured one. Always a bit crazy to see what people can 3D print in colour these days. Plus a fantasy one that works similar to the sci-fi one. Feels like you could make some good Inquisitors or Imperial Zealots with a couple of these. These are some past offerings for their sci-fi crate though. They generally have some interesting stuff coming. They've had some space dwarves or some assorted Egyptians in power armour in the past. I did quite like the big hovering brain bug on the right. That was a pretty cool miniature for the copy that they sent me. In any case, check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look, and certainly use that discount code if you sign up to them. Getting back to those blast templates though, I'd certainly say that one of the biggest things going in their favour is just the kind of fun factor of them really. People just enjoy mechanics that sort of make their models feel kind of evocative, and you can see what their guns and things are having impacts on the tabletop. And blast templates certainly feel like a good way of symbolising that. You can literally see the big craters and big explosions that the biggest guns in your army are making. The slightly random scattering mechanic also adds some slightly wild and fun events happening from time to time, potentially having your trained gunnery roll badly and then just casually vaporising the thing next door. Or as mentioned, the occasional surprise when you try and target something too close and say maybe have a Vindicator's big blast template scatter back over itself. Certainly all very random, but kind of fun with just the sheer chaos of big weapons fired at close range, not necessarily always having the best intended consequences. One other thing that I feel like they did quite well was allowing really big guns to hit multiple things as well. I'd probably argue that this is one of the things that current 10th edition Warhammer 40K just hasn't done quite as well. Like say if you've got an enormous weapon like a great big plasma gun mounted on a Titan or a Baneblade cannon, they certainly can have big scary damage profiles, but if you have them open fire against a big formation of enemy infantry units or multiple small vehicles nearby, they might just utterly blast one of them off the face of the map, but leave all the things standing next to them as completely unscathed. It just feels like it doesn't scale too well when you could have something like a Warlord Titan stomping around the battlefield, but its apocalyptic weapons can only basically kill one light vehicle at a time, meaning that weirdly 2 rhinos side by side might be oddly more survivable than a single Land Raider in some cases. Blast templates could allow things to have impacts on multiple units and not just the single target that you've declared on. Perhaps in a similar sort of vein to that, I did quite like the idea that you could have blast weapons get at least some hits when fired into a big formation, and current blast weapons definitely aren't quite as effective against things like sort of multiple small unit horde models, as opposed to single really big ones. Say for example, if you had 5 units of 10 termagants all standing next to each other, if you target any one of them with a 10th edition blast weapon, you'd still get +2 shots when attacking, but you wouldn't get any more than that, and it can be weird how their anti-horde is blunted just by splitting up the models into their own units arbitrarily, even if they're all standing nearby. Blast templates generally meant that you might have a good chance of hitting more, or if there's a wild scatter to still hit something. I guess they gave a sense that the gun was fired and that big explosion was going to land somewhere on the board, even if it might not be exactly where you wanted it. It could be kind of fun for things like orc shooting with low ballistic skill as well. There's a good chance that the shot might scatter horribly wildly, but if you're trying to throw it into the midst of an enemy formation, there's a good chance that it's going to land and affect something. For one thing that was maybe a bit more borderline, it perhaps meant the individual position of a lot of models on the board had one other thing to think about. You could do some squad tactics like deploying very spread out for your units if they wanted to try and mitigate the impacts of blast, or maybe bunch up more if they wanted to have more units relevant in melee. That's be another thing to make some decisions about, though I feel like from the perspective of using infantry, it did feel like a bit of a negative really. It meant that a lot of the time the units that just want to be daisy chaining out as far as possible, going to sort of 2-inch max coherency. It does feel kind of nice and more contemporary 40k that you can just deploy your squads in cool looking ranked up formations, and that's not a death sentence for them. It's quite nice to have some Space Marine units sort of advancing in lockstep with each other, or Tau Fire Warriors setting up a firing squad and being at least fairly safe in the knowledge that you're not just going to lose loads of models by doing that. I guess it could add some interest trying to avoid blast weapons as best as possible, and maybe also not bunch up your units so close that blast weapons could affect multiple of them, but I'm not sure if it was necessarily the most fun bit of tactics in the game, or something that people really wanted to be thinking about all the time when moving stuff around. For some of the areas that were perhaps bigger downsides to them, resolving blast templates, and particularly multiple of them, could take a fair bit of time. Using a blast weapon in past editions of the game would generally take a lot longer than just resolving a more normal shooting attack from a unit. First up, you've got to go and locate the template wherever it might be. Take a careful look over the enemy unit and weigh up where you want to put the marker, both bearing in mind how many models you could cover if you got a hit roll, and also thinking a bit as to where it might scatter. That wouldn't necessarily take the longest time, but it's an extra step. Then you'd have to roll a scatter dice, move it accurately, and to do that you'd probably need to go around to the side of the table where the unit was, quite possibly over in your opponent's side of the board, given that you're probably shooting their units there. Count up the models that were hit after that, and then only then start to go on to the next stages of the whole shooting attack, which you'd still have to do, so roll wounds and roll saves and things. Before doing that though, you might often have to resolve any other blast weapons that you had in the unit. Say for example, the Astra Militarum Wyvern was a fairly bad example. They were very, very efficient firepower, but each one of them would basically have 4 different small blast templates, all twin-linked, so you could re-roll the scatter dice, which took longer, and then they could even re-roll wound rolls as well, so that'd be even more re-rolls to resolve their shooting attack sequence. Resolving a firebase of those could certainly take a fair bit of time. It definitely meant that certain armies might struggle for time a little bit, and might be a bit tedious to play against if you're fighting against an entire gun line worth of blast templates. Apart from time needed, blast templates were also something that could cause disagreements in game as well. And compared with the vast majority of other 40k mechanics, they were probably one of the things that was most open to interpretation, and that meant that often you get both players trying to more generously interpret the blast templates more in their favour. A bit of this was just due to often you'd have people on different sides of the table, so you'd have people seeing the blast template and the scatter dice from slightly different angles, and it meant that from one player's perspective it might look like more or fewer models were under the template, particularly if it was borderline with the edges of models and such, and it's surprising how much people can interpret the line of a scatter dice, particularly if it's not rolled too close to the blast template, in a very different angle if you're looking at it from one side of the table or another. It's just hard to do it too accurately unless you're actually directly over it, which you might not be able to if it's in the centre of the board. Obviously most people didn't tend to try and abuse that or anything, but I think it's maybe a bit more common for 40k players to have a bit of an eye of optimism about their armies. If something's borderline, maybe being a bit more keen to argue that their unit isn't hit by the blast or their opponent's unit is. And could work the other way around as well. I feel like people will be less likely to deliberately go out of their way to protest things as well if it gave them a disadvantage. Obviously this really wasn't insurmountable, and 2 reasonable people could have a good outcome most of the time. You could normally tell when people were trying to gain advantages or being tricky, but at the same time, if you did meet such an opponent, there's definitely more scope for trying to gain advantages with blast templates and just measure or count things slightly inaccurately, due to them being a bit subjective, more so than just a single d6 rolled for number of hits. I'd say those 2 were perhaps the main criticisms of blast templates. There were a few other things that bothered me a bit about their implementation. I guess different rules could maybe fix some of these though. It certainly felt a bit weird with, say, just getting 1 hit from something like a battle cannon against a monstrous creature like a Wraith Lord or something bigger. It meant that despite firing an absolutely enormous cannon at what should be a good target for it, because it was a blast weapon, you could get a maximum of 1 hit if you did hit the thing, and even then you weren't guaranteed to wound, so you might have absolutely no damage and just have an unreliable chance of dealing 1 wound to the thing. And in general it meant that blast weapons just didn't really scale well. They often had rules to help them out against vehicles, but monsters got a clear pass. You'd probably need to have some sort of system where they could land more hits against big central targets if that's what they were focusing on in 10th, I guess. It also meant that blast and flamer weapons could often struggle to, say, finish off just 1 infantry by itself, whereas they might cause lots of casualties in their squad, which maybe has some grounding in fluff. It maybe felt a bit more weird from the flamer perspective, where you could kind of focus fire and just really bathe 1 guy in Prometheum. Otherwise, for a few minor things, the fact that you could snipe out individual members of units with certain things like mortars and barrage weapons was a weird thing. That was only around for an edition or so, but seemed like a very dumb rule that you could have some of the most inaccurate weapons in the game weirdly acting like snipers. Small blast weapons often felt like they were only really ever relevant if the opponent just wasn't very experienced and bunched up all their units. If you spread out the models to their 2-inch coherency, then small blast weapons basically just didn't tend to ever hit more than one model at a time, and blast weapons maybe felt like they were weapons that didn't scale enormously well, maybe being more impactful in really big games of 40k where entire deployment zones are just full of models, as opposed to smaller games where if you scatter a blast then it's probably missing everything, and they'll certainly be better against some armies than others, though I guess that isn't really the biggest downside in itself. Nice to have stuff that can answer certain units but not everything. Overall, between all that, it does maybe feel like a bit of a trade-off between fun factor and a pretty evocative mechanic on the game board versus ease of play, quality of life, and keeping the game a bit more streamlined without other random mechanics thrown in. I feel like with trying to balance out those, it's maybe not too surprising that some people might prefer to have them as part of the game and some people prefer not. I do like the general feel and kind of nostalgia factor for them, big explosions in formations, and the idea of firing off some ordnance with the knowledge it's going to hit somewhere, and occasional wacky scatter results definitely add to the fun factor. I think they absolutely do come with their downsides though, as well as just a bit more rules bloat. They can tend to slow down the game if they were implemented in the same way that they were before, and compared with just rolling dice and treating them as more normal shooting attacks, they were certainly way less precise than that and could lead to player disputes, particularly around what should be hit after a scatter dice move was done. And it looks like from your side of the table that your opponent has just moved their blast template just wildly different to where the line should be drawn. I'll be interested to hear your guys' takes down in the comments though. Feels like there's at least some arguments for and against depending on how you enjoy Warhammer 40k. It does seem very unlikely to me that Games Workshop would decide to reintroduce them at this point though. Even if there's lots of nostalgia, some cool things about them, and certainly some fun feels, they do perhaps feel a little bit counter to the sort of modern 40k game design that they've been going to, and that has been a period in which the game has grown absolutely massively. The big reset in 8th and then the various iterations of rules coming out after that, I think has been one of the factors that's caused 40k to become more popular recently. It does seem interesting that Games Workshop deliberately seem to have kept some of their game systems with their old mechanics around as well. The Horus Heresy and more recently the Old World go by the old systems using blast templates and other things. Maybe being some games partly aiming to capture the nostalgia for people playing older editions of Warhammer 40k or Warhammer Fantasy, and particularly like some of the mechanics like armor facings and blast templates and things. In any case, I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. Would you like blast templates to return to Warhammer 40k or not? I look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas. As mentioned earlier in the video, feel free to check out the Only Games crates linked down in the video description if you want a small painting project to turn up each month. And if you do, use that discount code when you're signing up. That can give you 1 month essentially free besides paying for postage. So a pretty good deal if you want a trio of sci-fi infantry for use in your war games. I'll leave that one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming with new ones out just about every day. If you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, check out the Patreon page if you'd like to support as well. There's some things for Patreon backers, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways. A big thank you to anyone supporting there, and a massive thank you for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.